Welcome to Legal Beagle.
Welcome to Legal Beagle, featuring attorney Kristina Lyke, founder of Lyke Law PLLC. Kristina provides expert legal insights and practical legal advice for legal situations. I'm Zofia Morales, and today's episode is Divorce Isn't 50-50, Debunking the Myths About Fairness in Michigan. Welcome, Kristina. I'm so happy to have you here with me today.
Well, thank you. How are you today?
I'm doing fabulous. Thank you so much for asking. So let's start with the whole concept of fair and equitable. What does this actually mean in Michigan divorce law, and how does that differ from a 50-50 split?
Sure. A lot of people indicate that Michigan is a 50-50 split. So Michigan is a no-fault state law. So we say it's fair and equitable. And what does fair and equitable mean? Fair and equitable means that we just don't take calculations and divide it by mathematical approach. And there's case law to explain that a little bit further. However, what we do is we try to make sure that premarital money, our premarital assets are not taken into consideration into the marital process. So they wouldn't be considered marital property at all. We also take into consideration inheritance, things of that nature. But what we look at is the separation of property, like personal property and real property. And this is a huge task to do because we have to look at what did you come into the marriage with? What did you acquire during the marriage? And the longer the marriage that you have, the more assets you're going to have to separate. So, there's a difference in separating assets because there's a couple cases that came out. One of them is the Cunningham case, and that is we're looking at that with inheritance and if somebody owned property prior, like a house prior to marriage, and how do we divide that, and what is fair and equitable. And we're going to be doing another segment on separation of property. But what I want everyone to understand is that fair and equitable property, I kind of like to give this little example. So let's say that you have a Corvette that's worth $10,000 and you have a Ford Focus that's worth about $6,000. And there's $4,000 of equity there, right? Yeah. So what I like to do is I say, all right, well, you have $6,000 worth of credit card debt. And let's say that we're in mediation. So I would say, my client really wanted that Corvette. And I knew that the other person wanted that Corvette just really, really bad. So what I would say is my client really wanted that and he has ties to that. But you know what? He's willing to go and give that to you because he knows how emotionally attached you are to that. Because you may have had an affair with that car or someone of that nature, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But what I would say is this: if you're going to take that car, then you're also going to take the credit card debt. Now, remember, there's only $4,000 of equity there. So what we do is we take the $6,000. So it's a little bit off kilter, but at least it's like fair and equitable because my client wanted that Corvette too.
Yeah, so and net, you kind of end up in the same place.
Right. And I try to explain that to people like in those circumstances, but there's a lot to fair and equitable. But a lot of times we try to make sure that the shorter the marriage is, we look at what were they prior to the marriage? Where were they at prior to the marriage? And we try to get them there. But the longer the marriage, you can't go and do that because you acquired so many assets. So we start with the Byington case. We start from the date of the marriage all the way to the date of the judgment of divorce. And that's how we separate property. But I'd like to do a segment and explain how separation of property, because it's very cumbersome.
Yeah, I was going to say there's probably some nuance there. I know you had mentioned the like inheritance and that kind of stuff. And you can confirm if I have this right or not, but I have heard, and I might have heard wrong, that if you blend inheritance with marital funds, that creates a gray area where the line is not as distinct anymore.
That is correct. But what I always start off with is this: if you have inheritance, that inheritance is yours. Now, if you go and mix it up with a joint account and you start adding assets in there, maybe it's been about 5 years, we have to trace. There's two cases out there, and that's why I would like to do a segment, and I'm going to in the future about this. But you have to trace that back. That's one of the cases that you have to do. Or there's a case that says something completely different, and we'll talk about that later, of course.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
yes, it does get blended, and so then you try to figure out what is fair and equitable in that situation, because that person passed away and gave that inheritance to you. It's not really fair if that other individual, your spouse, receives that when you're getting a divorce. That's not what they
Yeah.
intended.
Exactly. So, how does a fault like addiction or affairs come into play, even in a no fault divorce state?
So I just like to start off with Michigan is a no fault state, right? And I was a visiting professor over at Cooley. I was asked to speak there and talk about the Michigan bar. And so I always say, aha, though, because we actually have what is called a no fault, but we have what is called we take fault into play when it's dealing with property, a division of property. Like, for instance, we look at past conduct in relations. That's what we call it as fault. So
Okay.
that's one of the factors in dividing property. What we look at is extramarital affairs. Now, some judges don't believe that extramarital affairs are really fault. I'm old fashioned. I believe that they are, because if they become the breakdown of the marriage, and there's still case law that is still good case law that you can point out in your brief. But one thing I always like to share this one, because people say, well, how, if I have more fault, does that mean that I'm going to get a bigger settlement? Well, it could, but a lot of times it might be like a 55-45 split, or it might be something of the nature of you might just get a little bit more, or maybe the judge didn't think, maybe you were at fault too as well, because it takes two to make a marriage, two to end a marriage a lot of times. But one of the cases I always like to point out is I call it the rat poisoning case, right?
Oh,
And the
do
judge,
tell. This is intriguing.
yes, and I always like to tell this one, because this is one that is the complete breakdown of the marriage, right?
Oh,
And
okay.
they don't teach us that in law school, this case law, right? And so it's an unpublished case, but I've used it before in court. And what happened is this woman was married to this man and had a boyfriend, and they decided to use some rat poisoning to poison the husband. And I'm giving you the short story of it, but it was an attempted murder. So the husband paid for the criminal retainer for his wife. And I don't know what he was thinking on doing that fact, but during the divorce trial, the judge looked at him and ordered, you know what? You were the fault. You were the complete breakdown of the marriage, ma'am. And so you're going to get just the attorney fees that were actually given to you from the husband for your retainer. And you're not going to get anything else regarding the assets, because you were the complete breakdown of the marriage. So a takeaway on that: don't use rat poisoning or anything like that, and
Please.
right? But that's like a severe case. And also, you could use that when it comes to a severe breakdown, because there's a lot of times we see domestic violence could be a severe breakdown. The economic, because domestic violence actually comes in many, many facets. And a lot of times
Okay.
it's economic, and they take away everything, their friends, their economic power. And so that's the breakdown of the marriage. So you have to try to make sure that they are getting a fair and equitable divorce, but take that fault into play on that asset.
So, what should people know about hidden assets and spouses who are trying to protect what's theirs?
I we have what is called a CC 320 form. It's a disclosure form that each party is supposed to fill out, and we're supposed to go and switch it over to the other side. And it gives out personal information. That's the starting point on that. And we do a lot more disclosure than that, like discovery, we call it. But I always tell clients this, you might think you're very smart and very tricky and very suave. However, there's this case called versus Sands, that if you go and fail to disclose something and you did it intentionally, guess what? That other person can get the whole asset. So if we're talking
Ooh,
like, right, if we're
yeah,
talking about
that's risky.
$100,000 in retirement, well, I'm going to hide that and put it into an offshore account or something. Um, that can be very damaging. Another case, though, also says too that we'll divide it, equitably. However, you're going to have sanctions, and then you also have to pay attorney fees for having to bring this to the court's attention, which can be very expensive on your part too, as well. And they might take into effect too with the sanctions, like this was your fault for not going and disclosing this. So I recommend strongly not to go and try to be sneaky or tricky, because we have seen that, and it's not pretty.
No, that does not sound pretty at all. And it results in the exact opposite of what you had intended taking that action.
Right. Exactly.
So, how do you guide clients through property division when the emotions start to run high and threaten to derail a fair outcome?
One thing us attorneys have to remember is this, because they come in high strung and they've never gone through this process. They're very emotional. High emotions are running, right? And they want you to go after their husband or their wife. So I have to explain to them, okay, here's what the law is. Here's where we start off. We start off with the Byington case, and from the date of the marriage all the way to the end. Did you separate? There's lots of facets to divorce that we have to go and ask those questions, but I want them to tell me their story. And one of the things I always recommend is that an individual get their self-esteem back, right? Because a lot of times somebody can take their self-esteem away during the divorce. And I will say this, if you really want the truth serum, you go through a divorce, because a lot of times it is very painful to see what people do to each other. And so I try to recommend to people, you know, you need to roll back those emotions. I'm not a counselor. I don't pretend to be one. I'll try to find you a good one. And I know several counselors out there, but that helps them to get through their feelings. And I also have to tell them too that, look, this is the reason why I would never represent myself, because you take everything personal. And so you have to look at the optimistic view, and what can we do to get the best result for you? And so, and it's hard sometimes because you see some of the things that people do to your client, and you want to make sure that you fight hard for that individual, no matter what. But you see the hardship that they're going through, and how they financially drained them. And so you have to remember too that it's good that you have empathy, but you also have to make sure too that you got to do your job and make sure that you separate that a little bit.
Yeah. Do you ever get the client that's vindictive? I'm going to go crush them.
Yes, yes. A lot of people like to hire me because I'm a very strong, passionate, zealous attorney. That's what a lot of people say about myself. Um, and so they're like, "Yeah, I heard about you. You're like that bulldog. You're kind of like," and and I've gotten called lots of names. I've been called, several names. I won't mention them here, but and I take that as a compliment for myself, because I am being a strong advocate. But one of the things is that you do have to explain to them again, I will do my best and zealously represent you. But also, it's not about being the biggest jerk in a divorce, and it's about trying to make sure that you are getting a fair and equitable result. And sometimes during the divorce, you can actually do things to harm yourself and make yourself look poorly in front of a judge. And so you have to get those feelings under control for those individuals too.
So the next question is a shorter term marriage really easier to unravel, or do they come with their own unique challenges?
I will say this, I find sometimes my shorter marriages are the more difficult ones. And I don't I kind of come to the conclusion of this. I always like to find out why. Why are we going through this divorce? What was the reasons? And a lot of times it's because they were so infatuated with maybe their money at that time period. And then they lost all their money, you know,
Oh,
going gambling. They didn't know everything about this individual before they got married, or something of that nature. But the shorter marriages, it's like they really want to go after them. And I'm like, no, this is what we have to do. We have to try to make sure that we look at what you came into the marriage with, and make sure what you acquired during the marriage is fair and equitable too, as well. And there's some, though, I'd like to put this caveat out there, because there's some judges that don't believe that you should get spousal support for a short term marriage, and they try to put like a 5-year rule or a 7-year rule. There's no rule on that. I mean, you go through the spousal, there's a rule, there's spousal support factors, and that's under Sparks v. Sparks. But you have to go through all those factors to get that amount. So there's short-term marriages are very much more difficult sometimes than lengthy divorces. Well,
Interesting.
long-term marriages, I should say.
Long-term marriages, yes. Hopefully a less lengthy divorce, knock on wood.
Right? Yes, I have. I've had a few of those.
So why is it that people underestimate the complexity of dividing up like retirement accounts and business assets, for example?
I think a lot of people believe there's certain judges that have never done family law, never practiced family law too. And I've had a judge actually tell me, "Well, I don't know why this can't be handled this way, Miss Lyke. These improper people, meaning that they represent themselves, can do it." And their divorces are maybe 3 pages long. And I said, "Well, that's the reason why they come to see me afterwards, because I have to fix all those mistakes. Because what happens is they think this retirement they can just withdraw right away,
Oh yeah, no.
and you'll have tax repercussions. You'll have like 25% tax repercussion from the feds, 5% from the state, and then you might have a penalty from your employer too as well. So what we do is we have to educate individuals, and sometimes as attorneys we have to educate ourselves. And I call a specialist. A lot of times I'll call a friend of ours that over in Glomanis. Mike's a wonderful man. I send all my quadros over there, which is a qualified domestic relations order that stops the tax repercussions so that
Oh,
you're not going to have that worry. But also, there's defined benefit plans, contribution plans. We also have 401ks, IRA, and some people will try to give money for like an asset. And if it's out of a pension, you can't. You got to try to get dollar for dollar,
yeah.
and you're not getting dollar for dollar because if you took that money out, you're having those tax repercussions.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
I just had
You're
one the
you're
other day.
like 65% of what you thought you were getting.
Exactly, and people do that, and they're like, "Oh, this is great." I'm like, "No, it's not."
Oh, you got screwed.
Yes, you really did.
I don't think I was supposed to say that, but there it
That's
is.
right, you can blurt that one out.
Oh my goodness. So, what is your best advice for someone who's about to file and wants to protect themselves early, or maybe who's thinking about, well, we'll just settle it between me and the wife and do one of those 3 pagers?
I don't recommend doing your divorce by yourself. I don't even when I get a speeding ticket, and just so you all know, I don't get many of them, but I do have a lead foot sometimes. But if I had a speeding ticket or if I had a divorce or something of that nature, I would have someone represent me. Even though I do this for a living, I know what I'm doing. You take it personally, and you have to be optimistic. You have to have that perspective out there in the world and make sure that you're getting a fair and equitable settlement for yourself. And I would also tell people this: take pictures and make sure they're dated of every single room, whether it's the coin collection or anything, and make sure that you take your personals like your wedding ring or mementos that your kids give you. Put those someplace that it maybe your mom and dad's or a trusted friend for that time period. And then I would also say this: that you want to make sure you make a list of all the assets that you guys do have, and then make sure that you make copies of the mortgage payments, your deeds. And then I also have forms that there's details that I want, and there's specific details. So it makes it a little bit more easier for the individual to go through a divorce and less expensive.
Yeah. Well, and we're all for less expensive.
Yes.
So
And
getting your asset ducks in a row makes a huge difference, is what I'm hearing.
yes, it is, because some people can take those assets too. And how are you going to prove that? That's why I
Yeah.
say make sure you have the dated pictures, and have somebody with you going through video cameraing the house. And but the biggest thing is making sure, because some wives don't, or maybe some husbands too, do not have any control of the checkbook, do not know how much money is going out. I don't know, he just pays the bills. So a lot of times I help those individuals be able to do that later on after their divorce so they can control their checkbook. They'll have an Edward Jones account or something. I have these experts that help them, and I set them up with different people. Even if it's buying a car, I have an expert for those too. So
Excellent. And that sounds like some really good support, especially if you have been one of these spouses who's been out of the financial flow of what it takes to operate in this world.
Right. It's very difficult for them.
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today, Kristina.
Oh, my pleasure. It was nice to be here today.
Excellent. And thanks for tuning in to this episode of Legal Beagle with attorney Kristina Lyke. To contact Kristina, visit LykeLaw.com and be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a review so others who need this important information can find it easily.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.